And we are live here on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. What's up, guys? My name is Nick Scripp here on the P2W Fantasy Podcast, keeping the grind going through the fantasy football finish. Week 18 was just upon us last week. We are now in the fantasy football off season. Technically, we still have some football ahead of us here. So, figured now is the time to start talking about some dynasty trade targets. And I think the timing of dynasty is important for fantasy football leagues throughout the season. There's different times to capitalize on values, and there's times to go after certain players versus when players are not getting the hype that they deserve. We can go through all those certain timing pieces of dynasty leagues, but today's topic is recency bias dynasty trade targets, which I'll talk about here in a second. But before we get into anything, I do want to start off this podcast by saying this podcast is partnered up by the Fantasy Points Media Group. Go check out fantasypoints.com/subscribe, one-stop shop for everything fantasy football related that you would need. And as I said before, topic of the day, recency bias dynasty trade targets. So we'll get into that in a second. Stay tuned to the show.
I play to win, no fear to give. I feel but I can't forgive. I go all in this time, yeah, I won't regret. I'll pick the best on trip, they don't understand. I play to win, yeah, I play to win, I play to win. Yeah, I play to win, I play to win. Oh, play to win, I play to win. Yeah, I play to win, I play to win.
All right. So once again, solo pod this week. Probably will have some guests on in the coming weeks, but this is a topic I wanted to address right now, especially with a lot of teams not playing football right now. So this topic in general, I have some players in mind that can also relate to being recency bias dynasty trade targets, but they're playing in the playoffs this week. So knowing that all eyes will be on these players, I left some names out of this list that came to mind. So what we're talking about today is recency bias dynasty trade targets. And what does that mean? To me, that means some dynasty trade targets that due to late may not have had, the best outings or the best fantasy weeks, or, may have had a change in their dynasty values. And maybe they had a couple bad weeks, and some people that might have these players are kind of down on them, or their value has taken a dip. And I think now is the time to jump on this recency bias and start sending those offers. So I have a series of players. There's some names that, again, I left off the list because they're playing this weekend, but we'll kick things off. I think I might have like 8 guys to talk about today. So again, guys who might have a dip in their value, that now is the time to go jump on these players for trades. All right, so the first guy on the list here, and really rough season if you did manage this player, but Calvin Ridley. So the last time Calvin Ridley played was week 7. He's been out since then because of mental health issues that he was addressing personally that he came out and spoke about. This season specifically, he went weeks 2 through 4 with 10, 11, and 13 targets in games ranging from 14.1 to 19.3 PPR fantasy points. And everything in the show is PPR related. But we saw some decent games out of him early on in the season. Back in 2020, he was the wide receiver 5 overall. He had 5 games in 2020 of 21 plus fantasy points. He averaged 19.4 fantasy points in that 2020 season. Also in 2020, he had 8 games over 100 receiving yards. Back in 2019, if we go even further back, he played weeks 1 through 14 before he was banged up, and he was the wide receiver 8 overall during that span. So we've seen plenty of good games out of Calvin Ridley the past 2 seasons. He's the guy that can have any sort of game that goes over 100 yards. He's a guy that can take and handle the volume. He's a guy we've seen tons and tons of good fantasy weeks out of, but The downside right now is the fact that he has been playing football. There's rumors of a potential move. The GM for the Falcons also said something along the lines of he's in the future plan. So there's a lot of back and forth when it comes to Calvin Ridley. I think the biggest thing that stuck out to me is in a recent startup with some awesome analysts that I have been part of. I took him in the 6th round of a startup. And if we went back a year ago, I'd say there's no way he is being drafted outside of the 3rd. So you can clearly see that the value is shifted because of the uncertainty of when is he going to be back playing football? Is he going to be back on the Falcons? Where's he going to be? Is he good? We hope the best for this guy. Obviously, we want him to play football. But because of these uncertainties, that value's changed. So now is the time, I think, to go and target Calvin Ridley. And when I bring up these guys in this episode today, a lot of people will say, like, give actionable advice, and I can throw out, random picks and things like that. And I can start saying certain players, but at the end of the day, I can start listing some players, and you as a listener or a viewer will say, well, I don't have any of these guys. So what I would say is, start testing the waters with these guys. You can start sending out just some trade talks with managers. If you ever want to DM me and say, hey, is this a good offer for this player you talked about? Definitely do that. But sometimes it's kind of hard to give actionable advice in the offseason because I don't know what your roster looks like. I don't know what sort of league it is. But yeah, Calvin Ridley's the first guy. Awesome player. He's had awesome fantasy weeks. But the uncertainty is, is he playing? Where is he going to be next season? And he hasn't played in a long time, so his value has taken a dip. Next guy on my list, Juju SmithSchuster. A lot of S's there, but yeah, Juju hit the IR this season. He only appeared in 5 games. He was hurt in that 5th game, underwent a shoulder surgery. 2017, he was a 2nd rounder. He was super young. He's still only 25 years old. So he was drafted in 2017. He's still only 25 years old. He had 8 touchdowns in his rookie season. He went over 1,400 yards in his 2nd season. 2020 was the wide receiver 17. 2019 missed several games. 2018, it was the wide receiver 8 in that sophomore season. So the big thing with Juju is he gets a lot of stick because I feel like the expectations rose very high for him in Pittsburgh, especially after that huge sophomore season. And the fact that, a guy like Deontay Johnson came in and was taking a lot of the targets, and then they drafted Chase Claypool. There were some weeks where he was cold, right? But we've seen the ability to score a decent amount of touchdowns in the league. We've seen the ability to go over 1,000 yards receiving. What we have to keep in mind when it comes to Juju is I don't think he's going to be back in Pittsburgh. There's a lot of teams that need a wide receiver. He is going to be a free agent. He should be healthy. I mean, if we go down the list, the Lions, the Texans, the Jets, the Vikings, the Browns, the Eagles, the Saints, the Patriots, the Raiders, the Bills, Packers, the Bears. There's so many teams, and I'm probably missing a team that really needs one. But there's so many teams that need a wide receiver. And I think that a 25-year-old wide receiver that has done very good things for fantasy in the past is a guy that we should be looking at in dynasty leagues. And I know that he slipped down the draft boards for many people. He's a guy also took in that same startup pretty late, but he's a guy that's done it before. He's a guy that's young, and he's a guy that's probably going to be in a good opportunity come 2022 for this 2022 season. So Juju is another guy due to him not playing at all since week 5. I think his value is taking a big dip, and he's a guy you can target right now. Lamar Jackson. So some people have held on to the same sort of values. Some people have been concerned about his value. He's not played since week 14. He only played 14% of those snaps in week 14. He missed week 11 as well. Week 10, he only had 15.42, and then week 12, he had 9.4. Week 13, he had 17.62. So he's missed a lot of games for one, and then for two, he's had a lot of poor weeks in comparison to what the expectation is for Lamar Jackson. What's the upside, though? Looking just at this season. I mean, the guy was, an MVP not super long ago, but let's just look at this season. Week 2 versus Kansas City. He threw for 239 yards and a touchdown. He rushed for 107 yards and 2 touchdowns, 32.26 fantasy points. Week 5 versus Indy, he threw for 442 yards, which kind of like stuck it to the people that said he can't throw the ball for big passing days. He did. He threw for 86% of 43 pass attempts in that game. So that was a great passing day for Lamar Jackson. 4 passing touchdowns. Great passing day. 41.88 fantasy points. Week 9 versus Minnesota, 266 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 120 rushing yards, 30.64 fantasy points. The connection with Hollywood Brown looked pretty good this year early on before the bye. Rashad Bateman continued to trend in the right direction and develop. He did take a little bit of a dip, but then went back up. Mark Andrews was the best tight end for fantasy this year, which usually means he's very good for real life football. We know the rushing upside's there. The weapons look good. J.K. Dobbins is coming back. If people are concerned about him missing all this time and then having some down weeks, I think, again, now is that time in dynasty leagues like, hey, test the waters. Are people down on him because he hasn't played? Are people down on him because he's had some down games this year? I still really like Lamar Jackson. He's great for fantasy. Wouldn't be a podcast without talking about Elijah Moore, but Elijah Moore, again, has been a guy that hasn't played in a couple weeks. He landed on the IR. Then he was on the COVID list shortly after that. The wildest stat of the year for Elijah Moore is that he had 3 games of 20-plus fantasy points with 4 different quarterbacks. Mike White, Josh Johnson, Joe Flacco, Zach Wilson. Following the bye, weeks 7 through 13, if we combine those weeks, he was the wide receiver 3 overall as a rookie on the Jets. He saw a game with 2 touchdowns. He saw a game with 141 receiving yards. He handled a ton of volume at Ole Miss, and we see in the league now, give him the volume, he capitalizes. He hasn't played in a while, so the hype might have died down a bit. So again, timing is everything. Don't wait until people start looking back at those clips. I'd say now, when people know that I haven't had this guy in a couple weeks, he hasn't played in a couple weeks, this is the time, I think, to jump on an Elijah Moore offer in your dynasty league, because come next season, his price is going to be very, very high. Next on the list, Terry McLaurin. So he was super hyped up with Ryan Fitzpatrick until the hip injury for Fitzpatrick. Taylor Heineke really didn't come in and exactly up Terry's dynasty value or his redraft value. He had a really tough end of the season. He finishes the wide receiver 25 overall for weeks 1 through 17, which you would say, like, that's not an Allen Robinson of this year's season. It's not terrible, but many people had Terry McLaurin within their top 10 to 15 wide receivers going into the year. Since the bye, McLaurin played in 8 fantasy games. 50% of those games were under 10 fantasy points. Only one was 14 points or higher. A really rough stretch for Terry McLaurin the second half of the season. He had a handful of solid outings, which show his ability. 27.7 fantasy points week 2 versus the Giants, 30.3 versus Atlanta week 4, 25.2 week 7 versus Green Bay, 21.3 week 11 versus Carolina. On the flip side, though, 11 games under 12 fantasy points this year. Seeing the ability to go over 100 yards, to score touchdowns, to handle volume should bring you some confidence, because we have to think that, Heineke was a huge part of why Terry had a rough season. But we got to understand that also things are going to change. They have a great defense. This is a team with a stud wide receiver. They have a stud running back. They're going to be a team that wants to get back to the playoffs. So I doubt Heineke, after having a 65% completion rate and then a 20 to 15 touchdown to interception ratio, and then having a rating of 85.9. You have to understand that it's probably not in the future plans. So with the QB carousel, that's going to happen. There's some names out there of guys that might change teams. I think Washington is appealing because, again, they have a good weapon in Terry McLaurin. Curtis Samuel, healthy, is a decent receiver as well, with Antonio Gibson in the backfield, a good defense. This is a team that I think, given the right quarterback, can be very good. And seeing that Terry had a down year for what his expectations are, again, now is the time. Timing is everything. I'm staying on the Jerry Jeudy train. I get some shit for it all the time, and some other people, that primarily just tweet things all the time, have ripped him here and there. But I'm staying on the Jerry Jeudy train. It kind of has to do with some of the things I said about Terry McLaurin. So looking at Jerry Jeudy, he was, again, we're going back to him, his final season at Alabama, 77 receptions for 1,163 receiving yards and 10 touchdowns in, I think, like 13 games. I was huge on Jerry Jeudy coming into the NFL. He missed several weeks this year following an ankle injury. He had some games with some decent targets, but only had a few games that floated around 11 to 13 fantasy points. Two bigger games last year stand out to me. Week 9 versus Atlanta, 7 catches for 125 receiving yards and a touchdown, 24.5 fantasy points. Week 17, which is outside the fantasy season, but still, versus Las Vegas, 5 catches for 140 receiving yards, a touchdown, and 27 fantasy points. It's a small sample size of good games, but if you believe in the talent of certain guys in Dynasty, they're worth holding or they're worth trying to buy for the low, especially when things do not look good, because his season was not good because of the injury that he had, and then also because of quarterback play. I mean, we can't always blame the quarterback for everything. Bridgewater was, a manager out there, and the way that the Denver Broncos ran their offense, they weren't, focusing on getting Jerry Jeudy and the offense the ball through the air. I think they prioritized the run game a lot. Then you had Drew Lock playing, which we saw in his last game with Jerry Jeudy this season, overthrowing him like crazy. But again, to me, Denver is a very attractive place for a quarterback. And when we look at the names of Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers and Deshaun Watson, you have to think that on their short list, if they were to move, and maybe they don't move, but if they were to move, Denver's got to be on there. I mean, having a receiving core of Jerry Jeudy, Courtland Sutton, Tim Patrick, KJ Hamler when he comes back, Noah Fant at tight end. They have a great defense. They have a solid young running back. This is an attractive spot to be in for a quarterback. And Denver's either going to draft a quarterback or make a huge push to bring one in. So knowing that there's a high chance for the quarterback play to be better next year, now is the time to go and put in that bid for Jerry Jeudy before that happens. Because in the hypothetical world, they draft a stud quarterback out of this class, or in the hypothetical world that, one of these veteran quarterbacks ends up in Denver, his price is going to go crazy. So you have to do it now, or you're not going to do it in terms of trying to buy him. There's going to be a new coaching staff as well. So again, for me, I've seen small flashes in the NFL out of Jerry Jeudy, small sample size, but I still believe in the player. I still believe in the ability, and I still believe that things are going to get better in Denver for the quarterback position. So again, now is the time to buy before anything changes and then the price goes up, because right now, a lot of people are down on Jerry Jeudy. A lot of people are down on this offense because of what happened this season. Justin Fields. So I'm really excited for a shift in coaching and management for the Bears. Obviously, as a Bears fan and a Justin Fields fan, Fields missed the last 3 regular season games, which, again, some people were probably not playing him for fantasy, which means he's been sitting on people's benches. And when a guy is sitting on benches, that might be the time to go and knock on the door and say, hey, what are you looking for this guy? Does this trade work? Always offer something. Don't just ask that question. But looking at Justin Fields and looking at the upside this year, Week 8 versus San Francisco, 70.4 for his completion percentage, 175 yards throwing, 103 yards rushing, a touchdown in each category, rushing and throwing, 26.3 fantasy points. He was the QB5 for that week. Week 9 versus Pittsburgh, 291 passing yards, a touchdown, 45 rushing, 19.14 QB10 for that week. Week 14, 224 passing yards, 74 rushing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Week 15, he had 285 passing yards and a touchdown. He was the QB10 in both weeks 14 and 15 individually. So that's 4 times in Justin Fields' full games that he was a top 10 quarterback for fantasy. If that does not start making the red flashing lights go off, I don't know what will. Chicago is likely looking to probably pair Darnell Mooney with someone. I really like Kmet. I think Kmet has taken strides to get better in his play. I think he's got some areas to improve upon, but I really do like Kmet. Darnell Mooney has had excellent games this year. Darnell Mooney was very, very good. I am going to assume that the Bears are going to either sign a free agent, and I'll have some later shows on topics like that, or go after somebody. And I also like the pieces on the defensive side of the ball. That's going to help the team in general. David Montgomery does his job very well. So he played 60% of snaps or above in 10 games this year, Justin Fields. So I'm kind of going to repeat something. He played 60% of the snaps or more in 10 games this year. 4 of them, so 40% of them, were top 10 games as a rookie. Justin Fields is a major, major buy if you can right now. We saw the flashes of accuracy, flashes of passing yard upside, the rushing yard upside we know about, the total touchdown, both in the air and on the ground. We've seen that this year. He needs to limit his turnovers. He really does. He needs to not fumble the ball. He needs to not throw the interceptions. But we're talking about a rookie. Most rookies, we have the same sort of conversations for. So, again, Justin Fields, he's been sitting on people's benches for the last couple of weeks. If there's a time to buy, it's right now. And I'm going to be overly high in this guy with no Bears bias, just because, again, we've seen many weeks, multiple weeks this season, of him being a top 10 guy in his rookie year. Last guy, I put out some stats earlier on him, on Marquise Hollywood Brown, and I got like minimal interaction, if any at all. I think I had one like poor interaction with it. But Hollywood Brown weeks 1 through 7, Marquise Brown before the bye this season was the wide receiver 6 overall. In these games, PPR points and his finish. So he had 19.4 week 1, wide receiver 17, 23.3 in week 2, wide receiver 7. Skip ahead to week 4, 19.1, wide receiver 13. Week 5, 33.5, wide receiver 3. Week 7, 19, wide receiver 10. So he had multiple weeks as a top 10 wide receiver before the bye. He had many games, though, later on during the season that were pretty poor. So 10 fantasy points, I think, above. There was only one game of 15-plus after the stretch of the bye, looking later on. Lamar Jackson, missed 5 games following the bye. I think that was a big impact. I think them two looked pretty good together. There was a lot of times early on in the season where Lamar Jackson was actually throwing the ball a lot, and finding Hollywood Brown and seeing a stretch of games before the bye where he was pretty good and like decently consistent. That was a good sign for Marquise Brown. But then you look later on during the season, no Lamar Jackson, and Marquise is out there running around but not really doing much. I think he had a really, really poor second half of the season, which would open up a window for him to be a guy that you can go after in the offseason. I don't think anybody's super high on Marquise Brown right now. Rashad Bateman, I think, complements Marquise Brown well, and vice versa. Mark Andrews, we know, is a stud for the tight end position. I think knowing that there's 3 guys in the offense that can be thrown to, including J.K. Dobbins when he comes back, I think that helps Marquise Brown, because I don't think he's a guy that, can handle all of the focus on him. And we've seen plenty of games early on in this season where he was a top 10 guy, top 12 guy. So I think that his value is pretty low right now. And again, just seeing the glimpses of him and Lamar Jackson early on in the season, I'm still interested. So the guys that are left off this list that I do want to mention before we close the show out, I was going to talk about CEH a little bit. He's going to be the starter next season. The value on him has continued to trend in the wrong direction. He's missed time this year. The backup was good, Darrell Williams. Zeke's another guy whose value is going to continue to go down, but he still might be a guy that you can get for the low. And then Darren Waller is another guy. Missed most of the season. He's going to be 20. I think he's 29 right now, but next season, redraft or dynasty, if you are really looking to make a push towards a championship, Darren Waller is another guy to think about. But all three of these guys, what do they have in common? They're playing this weekend. So it's hard to go and buy guys that are going to play this weekend, especially if any of them, have a great day. But yeah, that's my list for now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 guys to consider as recency bias trade targets. And again, what do I mean by that? I mean that as of late, these guys either did not play or did not play well, which means their value might have taken a dip. And when values take a dip in dynasty leagues, that is the time to buy. So those are some guys to consider. Again, if you want to hit me up and say, hey, I'm thinking about trying to acquire one of these guys. Do you think this trade is a good one? Hit me up on Twitter. Hit me up on Twitter. I'll answer your DMs when I get a chance, and I'm always down to talk about some trades. But thank you guys for tuning in. Looking forward to this offseason. It's going to be a long grind. I'm going to be getting after it every single week with some guests, some solo pods as well. But trying to stay as active as possible, especially for you guys in these dynasty leagues. So have a good night, guys.